planning, the scapegoat of Ireland's housing crisis, and we're going to get into it today. Hello and welcome back to the Breaking Ground show here on iProperty Radio. I'm your host Carol Tallon, and today I'm coming to you from the offices of McCann FitzGerald, and I'm delighted to be joined by partner and head of planning and environment Brendan Slattery, who's going to break down the joint announcement of our housing and planning ministers last week. Brendan, thank you so much for welcoming us into McCann FitzGerald HQ
Delighted.
Today. And I know you've had a particularly busy week, so I genuinely appreciate it. Tell us what happened last week.
Well, look, it's a pragmatic response to a very specific pain point. When we introduced the legislation for strategic housing and accelerated the consenting of larger schemes, we started doing that 2018, 2019. Lots of those permissions have a 5-year life. You have to use them or effectively you lose them. That duration or life is fast running out. And you've seen the minister grapple with the statistics. We have 40,000 homes that are permitted and running out of time to be built. And at a practical level, you need all that time because you may lose time to judicial review, you may lose time to securing financing, confirming your viability, working through construction contracts, and ordinarily you're expected to have achieved substantial works within the 5 years. If you can't finish, then maybe you can get an extension of duration. And what's been announced is an amendment that does two important things. The first is, for anyone who's been delayed by judicial review, the time you burned in the court process is going to be given back to you. And that's really significant. The new Planning Act provides that, and it was a sensible, pragmatic response to eliminate the temptation for anyone to bring a challenge in the hope that the court process would slow it down long enough that the permission would be effectively unimplementable. And the response in the 2024 Planning Act, that's not yet in force, but what it says is permissions granted under the new Planning Act, you can, as a developer, if your permission is challenged, you can write a letter to the local authority, say, suspend my permission, and effectively put it on ice so that you keep your 5 years safe to the far side of the litigation. And what's been announced is that is going to be backdated. It's going to be retrospectively applied. So permissions under the 2000 Act that we're still living with, they're still getting permissions granted under, those that have been challenged, they can get their time back. If you think about schemes like Herbert Park, and the 105 odd apartments consented there, successfully we worked with the developers there to defend that permission from challenge in the High Court all the way to the Supreme Court. Lost 3 years in the court process. You think about Bailey Gibson, Player Wills, big schemes, lots of homes permitted that have spent 3 years in the court process. If you have a 5-year permission and you've already lost 3 years, 2 years is not enough time to persuade a bank or any other source of funds that they should bet on you getting to the finish line. Now those schemes have been able to spend probably 15-20% of the overall scheme budget on very big holes in the ground with a lot of concrete and rebar installed that allows them establish substantial works. But now, when this amendment is made, and the promise is it'll be made before the summer recess, so before the middle of July, it won't be necessary to take risk and try and achieve substantial works. You'll be able to just say, I was stalled in the court process, give me that time back. And it's not just home builders. This is renewable energy projects that have been challenged. The Carnagown wind farm, it's been challenged. It's successfully withstood legal challenge. All that time given back to them to be able to achieve and get through project financing on schemes of that scale. And if whether you're a small scheme or a big scheme, whether you're infrastructure, whether you're strategically significant, that time lost in the courts is going to be given back to you. And that seems just common sense and fair, because you can't practically get on with building. It has a chilling effect.
I think the numbers there were what maybe surprised people last week, and maybe what actually convinced the government to actually take action that we might say is as close to emergency action. So we saw there that over 19,000 units across 52 sites had been caught up in JRs over the last 5 years, but actually almost 16,000 had come through successfully.
Yeah.
And we're still challenged over that time. So do you know yet, or has it been made clear yet, how the retrospective rules, so how far back are we going?
Well, it's not stated. So the Minister for Housing and the Minister for State responsible for planning have issued a press release that promises this is getting priority drafting. We should expect within weeks to see the draft law, and we know that the government is in a position to conclude the lawmaking process before the middle of July. When you look at the provision in the 2024 Act, we see the playbook, if you will. Section 180 is there. That provision is absolutely shrink-wrapped to just protect permissions granted under the 2024 Act that are challenged by judicial review in the modified form that judicial review will take under the 2024 Act.
Okay.
The expectation is, and certainly the demand from industry across all sectors, is that it should apply to every permission and any kind of judicial review challenge, and even challenges that question validity indirectly. So you might have a litigant in person, a lay litigant, who brings proceedings that are not properly shaped because they're an ordinary person doing their best in the court process. That too slows you down, and anyone affected will be looking for their time back. And the suggestion in the press release and what we've heard from the department is that you will have an obligation on you to give notice to the planning authority that you're seeking the time back. And so for those 19,000 homes affected by judicial review, all of those will have additional time in order to be able to complete. And that doesn't matter how quickly they'll complete afterwards. The time given back to them is the time they lost in the court process. So, and there's a fairness to that. There is a fairness to that. And what it does is it eliminates, I say, the temptation. Like I can remember when we helped secure permission for the Ringaskiddy Waste to Energy project, the incinerator project down in Cork, the first permission, we were delayed in court for 5 years. The entire of the life of the permission was lost to legal challenge, and that's what then prompted the next application for permission. They had to go in again. It'll spare us doing things like we're doing at the Dublin Central site, you know, that location between O'Connell Street and Moore Street, Henry Street to Parnell Street. There we're making requests for 12-year permissions because we anticipate delays relating to Metrolink, we anticipate delays relating to legal challenge like the one brought by the Moore Street Preservation Trust, and we want to make sure we have that time in order to be able to not have to go back in for a fresh application. Because right now, before this amendment, if you're challenged and you had a 5-year permission, you're probably starting the fresh application process at year 3.
Explain to me historically, before last week, what was happening as permissions were running out or coming close to running out. So obviously we can see that the risk would make them certainly a challenge for financing, but also to actually execute the work. But actually what was happening when developers were trying to extend that planning, generally speaking? Was it being granted for an extension?
So it's tricky, and some of it comes from changes we made in 2021 as well. So just to step back, we only introduced short lives on permission in the 80s, and we allowed a method for extending them where you had carried out substantial works, which the courts have always been reluctant to put a number on. There isn't a percentage. It's the opposite of insubstantial. It's demonstrating irreversible commitment. It's Macbeth in blood stepped in so far. It's avoiding white elephants. It's pragmatism in play, where there's a huge discretion for the local authority on what actually is substantial. Post the crash in 2008, we amended the legislation to protect the value of property that was being transferred to NAMA effectively. And we introduced a second basis for extension where there were commercial, economic or technical reasons that delayed commencement of development. And NAMA had an extended power to be able to request extensions of duration even after permissions had expired, which was unique because typically you had to keep the permission alive and make requests to extend it while it was still alive. You couldn't ask after the fact. We removed that power in 2021. And so since 2021, the only way to get more time on the clock is to complete substantial works. Developers then coming close to the end of the life of a permission are then faced with that choice. Can I rush to complete? Can I get an extension, or do I make a fresh application for planning permission? And if you take a site like at Herbert Park, you'll see there's a separate standalone application for large-scale residential development. So another horse comes along that they can jump to if they need it. They also did seek an extension of duration, were refused, had to challenge that, and then made a second request, and that was granted. And now this legislation will come and give them the time back anyway. But clients are having to be creative. And it's not just in home building. Like, if you think about the Rossaville scheme and the harbour works there to unlock the potential for offshore development facilitating, they had an extension of duration granted, which was then quashed in court and left them with a court challenge process that's created problems for the completion of the rest of those works. So it doesn't matter the sector. This is one that just protects people who've been delayed in court. But you're right, we have a method under the Planning Act for trying to solve this. It's currently substantial works. This will be much more broad. The new Act takes a totally different approach again. It forces you to think about whether something's a material or immaterial change. And we don't know yet what that really means. Is it enough to have done work, or does having done work make no difference anymore? We don't know.
Before we move on to the new Act, and I do want to talk to you about the implementation plan there, I'm curious to know what phone calls you were getting from your developer clients last week.
There are some who've been working hard to achieve substantial works, thinking, if I knew this was coming, I wouldn't have spent my own money for the last year. But the enthusiasm is there that this is a pragmatic and sensible response. It's not the only change they're making on extensions of duration. If we look at the numbers, about 19,000 homes affected by judicial review, where that time will be given back. But there are something like 40,000 homes, even just in the Dublin County area, which are not yet commenced and on sites that are labelled inactive. And those permissions, most of them rather, are in the last 2 years of their life. And what they're also going to introduce is a method for those to get an extension without having done any work. And so that's separate from the judicial review reform. That's a specific housing focused request for extension. As explained, it's if you have a housing scheme and you're in the last 2 years, come and ask for 3 more years and we'll give it to you, provided that you commence within 6 months and you complete within 18. So the idea is
that realistic for, say, the clients that you're dealing with, and obviously you don't need to discuss them here today unless you'd like to, but in terms of the cases that are on your desk at the moment, do those conditions work? Does that criteria actually help?
Most of the clients we're dealing with are really giddy to get on site. They are looking for the capital necessary and the planning permissions that are relevant to allow them get boots on the ground. I think most of the people who will benefit from that are ready to go and will be happy and willing to get their extension, to give them the time to complete financing and construction contracting to get the boots on the ground. There's some devil in the detail yet. Let's see how they deal with the sites that needed environmental assessment. The impression I have is that there's a caveat at the minute that says you can't get extensions where what's left to be done after the permission expires is something that would require environmental impact assessment or appropriate assessment under the Habitats Directive. For bigger schemes, that's potentially a problem. For schemes with fewer than 500 units, if they didn't need an EIA to get the planning permission, they'll probably be okay, unless something very material has happened to the surrounding environment or to the parallel other projects being carried out in the neighbourhood. So we need to see some of the detail on that one to be as excited about it.
You know, I started by saying, and this is really a direct quote from the president of the Irish Planning Institute, Gavin Lawler. You know, he talked about planning being made the scapegoat of this housing crisis, and he's not wrong. It is, so whether it's rightfully or wrongfully, he's not wrong in the fact that it is routinely, and we see that through industry events when the industry comes together. We see it through media commentary, although sometimes that can be a little bit misrepresentative of what's happening on the ground. But from your experience in actually working with the people who are doing this, what are the other obstacles, or what are we not understanding about the planning that just is failing to translate into delivery on the ground?
Well, at a very practical level, when looking at a site for purchase or investment, you think, does it have planning permission? We're focused on, does it have planning permission? Because we see it's the value that's added by having obtained the permission is what's key, because there's so much risk in, will you get permission, or might that permission be challenged? And the will you get permission, it used to be easier to predict that you'd be granted permission. And two things happen. One is a tension between central and local government about what it is the scale of our ambition is and needs to be. And second, around preconditions around things like, are the lands serviced well? And when we look at how we make local area plans, development plans, we know the revised NPF, the National Planning Framework, has set a target that's loud, clear, and that's double the ambition of what we last had. When you look at it like that, it's really important that local authorities are given the tools to be able to give effect to that. That will mean more zoned land. It will mean core strategy tables with housing supply targets that have bigger numbers in them, which then brings you up against, what about the infrastructure to match that? And we're seeing feedback from local authorities saying, you know, the second level school doesn't have space, Irish Water hasn't signed off on this, never mind, let's talk about the electricity. My response to that is, those are infrastructure deficits that are capable of being resolved within the life of the plan. And that should never stop you from zoning the land that's required to meet the scale of ambition we have, which is double what it was before. And I think there is still a natural conservatism, partly from the scars of ghost estates in the past. And we don't want to make bad decisions, and we don't want to make decisions that see homes built that can't flush the toilet and therefore can't be sold. But we need to move all these pieces forward in parallel, not in sequence. And we're caught a bit in relation to, take for example, when the last government stated its ambition on height, building height and density, for example, the expression was stated with language that left the courts to interpret what the words meant. And the courts regularly, first at the Premier Dairy site as you go out Glasnevin to Finglas, to say actually what's required is that there be high capacity, frequency public transport, and it needs to be in place now before we grant the permission. So it's set very clearly whether the chicken or the egg comes first. And government didn't respond. It didn't amend the guidance to say, actually, no, we're happy for you to spend 3 years building while we complete bus connects. We're happy for you to get going to have the demand for the public transport emerge at the same time as the transport solutions are delivered. And so what you see different in the revised planning framework is it's very clear, it's unequivocal. And we're seeing local authorities already push back against that and say, well, hang on, we're Dún Laoghaire at Down County Council, we've already consented enough homes. We're seeing, Wicklow County Council push back and say, actually, until we're told where exactly these additional homes, the whole of the 300,000 by 2030, are to be delivered, who's to say it's going to be in any of our urban areas? And so maybe we don't need to zone more land, activate more land, or add additional numbers to the core strategy. And that's where the next piece from the Minister for Housing is going to be really important. Those Section 28 guidelines to give real guidance and directions to local authorities on what needs doing, because my anxiety at the minute is that there is a reluctance for individual authorities to take on the burden that's about to be, and already has in fact been, put upon them. And one of the things that we had seen, and actually that the announcement, while we focused on extension of duration, actually picks up on something that was a pain point for local authorities. There's a transitional provision needs to be inserted into the new Planning Act, and they've promised to do this because we had caught ourselves in something of a trap. As we emerge into the new Planning Act, the existing plans and guidelines will all be transitioned over, will all be carried forward, brought forward, but only if they've been adopted. And if you had been in a local area plan or variation plan process that got to 80% or 90%, and if the Planning Act was turned on the next day, all that work would be wasted and lost.
So would that local authority been started from scratch?
They'd have to start over again. That was one of the unforeseen maybe consequences of specific drafting. And the problem is, at the same time, we need to turn on those provisions quickly in order to allow us complete the next cycle of development plans that are to be the 10-year development plans. So if you think about those plans made from 2021 to 2023, they have a 6-year duration. They're coming up for review. There's usually starting that process from local authorities who made their plan in 2021. They've started now. And they need to make sure that the work they're doing now is 2024 Act compliant. So there's a pressure to get the development plans right. We need to turn on the Act, but if we turn it on too fast, we throw a lot of work in progress in the bin. And what this transitional provision will do is make sure that doesn't happen, because it's too blunt currently.
Yes.
And so we'll be able to do the work on the local area plans and more importantly, the variations to development plans that need to be done to give effect to the NPF. We can do that work confident that if we invest the time in doing it as a local authority, it won't be wasted, and we can complete it under the 2000 Act.
That's really interesting around those provisional arrangements, because I wasn't aware of that, but I had gone through, say, the phased implementation plan that has been set out over the next 18 months. So does that give enough clarity? Because one of the things that we've seen in recent years has been ad hoc policy making, ad hoc responses, that we are striving to get that certainty. And while there might be dissent around many aspects of the new Planning and Development Act, and indeed around the NPF, whether it goes far enough, you talk about double the ambition, but actually, are we still working to the targets, or are we still only working to where the ball is at as opposed to where the ball is going to land? And that's part of a larger argument. But in terms of the certainty that's needed to bring back the capital that we need to actually, for your clients to be able to plan out the developments and start in the confidence that they'll finish with this same degree of certainty, have we achieved that much?
I've been sceptical about certain features of the 2024 Act, and I'm emerging into my more optimistic phase about the legislation. I think because it doesn't change that much, actually is a good thing. And I think some of the changes it's made will facilitate and enable prompt decision making. Ultimately, we're back to resourcing our decision makers well. If we want good development plans, we need to resource forward planning. If we want good planning permissions that will withstand scrutiny in the High Court, we need to make sure Bord Pleanála and decision making in local authorities is well resourced. And it's a point fairly made that there's probably still about a third too few planners in the public system. And that is probably the single biggest feature of planning that is the difference between success and failure. Yeah. And if you think of even small things like when we've got a permission, so we've gone through planning, we've got our zoning, we've secured our permission, and now we're into compliances on the conditions. Currently, when we make a compliance submission, or a client makes a compliance submission, they can be confident that they'll get an answer within 8 weeks. And they'll get a reason for the local authority disagreeing or hesitating, and you can engage, respond, and make a better submission. Under the new Act, we're about to change that. So the default is that the local authority is disagreed. If they can't come back within the short period of time, it's a fail rather than a pass. Under the current legislation, it's a pass rather than a fail. And that just forces urgency, forces attention. The new Act is a step back in that respect. And I think that's something that can still be fixed, because I think what's not appreciated is how important that compliance phase is to activating the lands. Because when we're going through funding, we're going to have to demonstrate that we've satisfied our pre-commencement conditions. And you might have a target date for drawdown of funds, but we're not going to satisfy that condition precedent unless we have an answer back from the local authority that says it's all okay.
I'm glad you touched on, so many of the issues are overlapping, but I'm glad you touched on the skills issue, because I know that that's something that the OPR has a very strong campaign at the moment to actually promote a career in planning, and they're doing it in a very compelling way. It's a very strong campaign, but we still have our challenges in terms of, I think it's somewhere in the region of between 60 and 70 graduate planners coming through the system within the Republic of Ireland every year. So it's a small number. They're doing what they can in that, but I suppose the inclusion of planners on the critical skills list has to be welcome. So in terms of transferable skills, people coming in from other jurisdictions, do you see that being a solution for our local authority shortages?
Well, hopefully, but the English language speaking world, many of it has the same problems we have too regarding housing and infrastructure. They're needed there also. I think when we look at the planning graduates coming through and the number of those graduates who would have been forced to work abroad after completing their masters here, it solves that, and immediately you can see how those who are contributing to those courses, and we work with and support several of the masters courses ourselves. They know the ambition that's required too. I think we're going to need to be broader in how we think about what is the core subject you start with that's relevant to you being a planner, because one of the beautiful things about being a planner is maybe it doesn't matter that your degree was geography or that your degree was engineering or environmental science. Honestly, sometimes it feels like you'd be better off being a history graduate in order to be able to properly explain why something should be permitted at a given location, because tracking the chronology of the site over time or tracking the chronology of policy's evolution over time is almost as relevant. So I think there's a broad church of people who will be relevant, particularly when you think about master planning on big schemes. The skills required, especially as we get into digital enhancements through AI and the like, there will be a broader church of people that I think will be relevant to how we placemake into the future. So that's definitely something I think we can be broader in our scope.
I very much welcome that. And before we finish up today, I'm going to ask a cheeky question. Did you write a guidance email to your clients after last week? And if you did, can you share the headlines?
We have captured some thoughts and targeted specific clients with feedback on the legislation. The truth is, until we see the first draft of the bill, it's difficult to ascertain, are you in or out? But there are a couple of clients where straight away say, those 3 schemes are now, you should expect to have more time. And it just changes how we think about the schemes. And we have some schemes that are still under challenge, projects that are still under challenge, where we had lost the will to continue defending the permission or to continue investing in that particular permission, where now that permission is worth investing in because it's got more life on it than we thought. And so it allows you, especially if you're looking at a wider land bank, and if you're targeting into the thousands of homes per annum, you probably have others where you're able to pause and think, actually that permission's not dead yet. And certainly there's a number of clients who are active on that, and we'll happily share when we go public on our observations when we see the bill.
Very good, thank you. And finally, you are speaking and hosting the Irish Planning Institute's Summer Law Conference coming up in a couple of weeks. What can attendees expect to see and hear?
I can't remember the venue we've chosen for this event, but Robert Kerrin and the team at IPI is hosting, and I'm delighted to be able to join the event. And I know that Deirdre Nagle, Niall Handy and Suzanne Murray will be joining on the platform discussing everything that's happening in planning in the last 6 months. And you can expect a discussion around the local area plan themes. You can expect, and that's broad, not just the amendment that's now proposed, the transitional provision, but also what's been happening in Wicklow with expired LAPs, with the prospect that your chance to apply for large-scale residential development has been frustrated by an expired LAP, and how that's resolving. There's obviously, we're at the rate where now, in the last, since the court year starts in sort of September, October, this court year we've had 80 judgments out of the High Court of Appeal and Supreme Court dealing with planning and environment. The big themes will be covered. The issues around cool glass may be touched upon, the renewable energy projects and the prospect that there's a tilted balance in their favour because of the urgency and pressing need of that crisis, and the potential that that maybe translate through to housing. And I've been asked to take the bait on the relevance of AI and Gen AI to planning decision making, and how that introduces risk factors that we need to think through as we embrace those large language models in preparing the work in the planning system. So plenty to cover.
Excellent. Sounds like an unmissable event. That's the Irish Planning Institute's Summer Law Conference, and it's worth noting that it's an in-person event, but actually there is an option there to attend via Zoom, so head over to the Irish Planning Institute for further information. But for us today, that's it. Thank you so much, Brendan Slattery, and to all the team at McCann FitzGerald for allowing us in. My thanks as always to producer Katie Tallon, and you can catch up on our Breaking Ground series on iPropertyRadio.com.